The dust of the Nevada desert settled on everything at Blackwood Range, a fine gritty powder that worked its way into machinery and dispositions alike. It coated the matte black transport that deposited Vance at the main gate, a solitary figure against the vast indifferent landscape. The guards glanced at her simple fatigues and single duffel bag with practiced disinterest. Her paperwork identified her as a technical consultant, a title vague enough to mean anything. One of them grunted, jerking a thumb toward the sprawling windowless hangar. "In there, don't wander." She gave a single, barely perceptible nod and walked past them. The air inside the hangar was cold, sterile, and thick with the electric hum of advanced technology and the palpable weight of frustration. A team of engineers and pilots were gathered around a central command console, their voices sharp with disagreement. They were the nation's best, called from elite universities and top-flight squadrons, and their collective arrogance was a tangible force field. No one noticed her entry. She found an unoccupied corner near a secondary power conduit, set down her bag and began to watch. Her stillness was not timidity, but patience, the deep ingrained discipline of a predator waiting for the hunt to begin. Her gaze drifted to the object of their consternation, the Acheron drone. It was less an aircraft and more a shard of obsidian given flight. All sharp angles and non-reflective surfaces designed to devour radar signals. It was a technological marvel, the supposed future of untraceable reconnaissance, and it was a complete and utter failure. Colonel Madsen, the base commander, finally addressed the consultant he had been told to expect. He held her personnel file in his hand, though it was less a file and more a single sheet of paper, thin and insulting in its brevity. Most of it was blacked out with thick, unapologetic redactions. "Vance," he said, his voice clipped, "says here you have some field experience with remote systems." The pause dripped with condescension. He looked up, his eyes sweeping over her unassuming frame. "We have pilots with thousands of hours in the most advanced fighters on the planet. We have engineers with doctorates from Caltech and MIT. Their resumes are somewhat more substantial than this." He let the single page flutter onto the desk. Lieutenant Hayes, the lead test pilot, stood nearby, a smirk playing on his lips. "With all due respect, Colonel," he chimed in, his tone making it clear no respect was intended. "We're neck-deep in diagnostics. We don't really have time to babysit." Madsen's gaze returned to Vance, cold and dismissive. "So, I'll ask you directly. What exactly do you believe you can contribute to the Acheron program?" Vance's eyes were steady, her expression unreadable. Her focus was on the drone, visible through the reinforced glass. "I'm here to observe the system," she stated, her voice quiet but firm, carrying no hint of defiance or apology. The simplicity of it seemed to irritate Madsen more than an argument would have. "Fine. Observe. Just stay out of the way of the people who are actually doing the work." Hayes shot Vance a parting glance of victorious pity before following the colonel out. For the next 3 days, Vance became part of the hangar's architecture. She stood in the periphery, a silent observer, her presence so unobtrusive that the team soon forgot she was there. They took to calling her the scribe or the shadow, noting the small leather-bound notebook she carried. But she was not watching the pilots. She was watching the data. While the engineers focused on the software crashes and the pilots complained about the violent neural feedback, Vance watched the energy schematics. She saw what they missed: infinitesimal fluctuations in the Acheron's power distribution, subtle energy spikes in the drone's biomimetic processors that corresponded not to pilot input, but to atmospheric variables. The system wasn't just unstable, it was sensitive, responding to the world around it in ways its creators had never intended. They were trying to cage a wild animal, and it was fighting back. During a lull in the testing, as a flustered engineer cursed at corrupted code, Vance's hand unconsciously drifted to her left wrist. She pushed back the simple black band of her watch, revealing for a brief second a faded tattoo on her inner arm. It was a complex stylized design, a spectral ghost-like figure woven together with the silhouette of a single raven's feather. It was an old symbol from a life no one here knew she had lived, a marker of a unit that officially no longer existed. She pulled the watch back into place just as Lieutenant Hayes strode past. "Whole damn program's a bust," he muttered. "You can't fly a ghost." Vance watched him go, a flicker of something ancient and knowing in her eyes. He had no idea how right he was. The problem wasn't that the Acheron was a ghost. The problem was that none of them knew how to speak to one. The pressure mounted with the inevitability of a coming storm. A 4-star general from the Pentagon was arriving for a final go or no-go demonstration. The Acheron program, billions of dollars over budget and years behind schedule, was on the chopping block. Failure was not an option. It was an execution. The hangar was now a tinderbox of raw nerves and frayed tempers. Lieutenant Hayes was selected for the demonstration flight. His usual swagger was brittle, a thin veneer over palpable tension. He strapped himself into the pilot's chair, the neural interface headset gleaming. "I've got this," he said, his voice too loud. No one looked convinced. The initial launch sequence was flawless. The Acheron lifted with eerie grace, its engines emitting a low, almost subsonic hum. On the main view screen, the drone climbed smoothly into the stark blue desert sky. The mission was a complex reconnaissance run through a network of narrow, winding canyons known as the Labyrinth. For 5 minutes, everything was perfect. Hayes, growing confident, pushed the drone faster, weaving through the rock formations with aggressive precision. Then it happened. A flicker on the data stream. Alarms, soft at first, then rising to a frantic shriek, began to blare. Feedback spike. "I'm losing the link," Hayes yelled, his face suddenly ashen. On the screen, the Acheron pitched violently, its graceful flight devolving into an uncontrolled death spiral. It careened toward a sheer canyon wall, the granite face rushing up to meet it. Panic erupted. Engineers shouted contradictory instructions. Madsen stood frozen, watching billions of dollars and his entire career about to be pulverized against a cliffside and the heart of the chaos. While every eye was fixed on the screens predicting imminent disaster, Vance moved. She did not run. She walked with calm, deliberate purpose. She crossed the room to a secondary maintenance terminal, a dusty, forgotten console. No one noticed her. Her fingers met the keypad and a silent storm of activity bloomed on the small amber screen. Her hands moved with fluid, blinding speed, not just typing but dancing across the keys. She wasn't fighting the system. She was communing with it, inputting lines of code that were less like commands and more like a soothing whisper in the machine's own native language. With surgical precision, she identified the cascading error that had sent the neural feedback into a fatal loop. She isolated the corrupted data packet, purged it from the system's short-term memory, and rerouted the Acheron's primary flight control functions to her own terminal, completely bypassing Hayes's overloaded interface. The entire process took less than 4 seconds. On the main view screen, the effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. One moment, the Acheron was plummeting towards certain destruction. The next it stopped. It simply stopped, hovering 100 feet from the canyon wall, motionless as a hummingbird. The frantic alarms cut out, plunging the control room into stunning, profound silence. For a moment, the drone just hung there, a black specter against the red rock. Then, with a liquid grace that none of its designers had ever thought possible, it executed a perfect slow 180 degrees pirouette, leveled off, and resumed its mission flight path down the center of the canyon. As if the entire incident had been a planned, elegant maneuver, the room remained silent. Vance took one step back from the terminal, her hands falling to her sides. Her work was done. She melted back into the shadows she had emerged from, her expression as calm and unreadable as ever. The silence stretched for an eternity, thick with disbelief. It was finally shattered by the sharp voice of the visiting general's aide, a young, sharp-eyed major. "Control, what in God's name was that? Who has the aircraft?" Every head in the room swiveled as one, their gazes searching and finally landing on the lone, still figure of Vance standing quietly by the forgotten maintenance terminal. Lieutenant Hayes, now disconnected from the neural interface, sat slumped in his chair, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He stared at her, his arrogance completely stripped away. "How," he stammered. Madsen approached her, his steps slow and deliberate. The institutional certainty that had defined him was gone. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice low and devoid of its earlier condescension. "Explain what you just did." Her gaze remained fixed on the main screen where the Acheron was now performing its reconnaissance patterns with flawless grace. "The Neuralink has a sympathetic feedback filter," she said, her voice even and calm. Lieutenant Hayes was pushing the system too hard. He was fighting it. It created a resonance cascade. She paused. "You were trying to command it." It needs to be guided. Her simple explanation hung in the air, its profound implications slowly dawning on the engineers who had spent years trying to bludgeon the machine into submission. Near the back of the room, a grizzled master sergeant squinted, his eyes narrowing as a distant memory surfaced. Ghost Recon, he muttered. Heard they had a whisper pilot back in the day. Someone who could sync with prototype tech nobody else could touch. They said she could fly anything with a circuit board. He looked directly at Vance. Call sign was Echo. The name dropped into the charged silence like a stone into a still pond. Vance did not acknowledge the name. She did not react at all, but for a brief, unguarded moment, a flicker of something ancient and deeply weary passed through her eyes. The visiting general was now intensely interested. The near disaster had transformed into a stunning display of unprecedented capability. The program was suddenly the most promising project in the entire defense portfolio. But he needed more than a single miraculous save. The next morning, a new trial was ordered, unscheduled and designed to be brutally difficult. The objective: locate a small, mobile, electronically shielded target vehicle hidden somewhere within a 500 square mile sector, an area deliberately flooded with decoy signals and electronic countermeasures. A needle in a haystack search in a field of magnetic chaff. This time there was no discussion about who would pilot the drone. Colonel Matson approached Vance not with an order but with a question. "Ms. Vance," he said, his tone now one of profound deference, "will you fly the Acheron for this trial?" She responded with a single simple nod. The atmosphere in the control room was transformed. The swagger and nervous energy were gone, replaced by a tense, focused silence. Every person was an observer, a student waiting for a masterclass to begin. Vance sat at the primary command console. She slid the neural interface headset on. When she initiated the link, the data streams on the monitors were not the jagged, chaotic spikes they had been with Hayes. They were serene flowing lines, a calm, steady rhythm like a sleeping heartbeat. The connection was seamless, symbiotic. She launched the Acheron, but her technique was utterly different. She didn't force it into the sky. She eased it into the air, letting it catch the morning thermals, its movements economical and fluid. She wasn't piloting a machine. She was wearing it. She flew for hours, ignoring the cacophony of electronic decoys. She wasn't just looking through a camera. She was using the Acheron as an extension of her own senses. She felt the subtle shifts in air temperature, saw the faint traces of disturbed earth that nature would not have made, perceived the unnatural patterns in the foliage. She was thinking not like a pilot but like a hunter. Her consciousness spread across miles of desert, sifting through reality itself for the single discordant note of her prey. Hours bled into one another. The sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent. The initial tense optimism had faded into quiet, respectful resignation. The task was, as designed, impossible. Even Matson's newfound faith was starting to waver. Then, cutting through the low hum of the servers, her voice came, calm and clear. Target acquired on the main screen. The view zoomed in with impossible speed and clarity, bypassing a cluster of decoy heat signatures, and focused on a small rocky overhang miles away. There, tucked perfectly into the shadows, was the target vehicle, completely invisible to any standard sensor. A wave of stunned applause broke the silence. While the general and his aides celebrated the astonishing success, a priority message alert flashed on Colonel Matson's personal terminal. It was a Pentagon-level eyes-only encrypted communicate, a direct response to his urgent query for the unredacted file of technical consultant Vance. With trembling hands, he entered his credentials. The file opened. It was still almost entirely blacked out, but a few lines had been cleared. Subject: Vance Ella M. Former unit: Joint Special Operations Command, Task Force 7 designation Ghost Recon. Officially disbanded. Mission history: classified. Notable skill set: specialist in prototype neural interface piloting, deep infiltration assets. Last known operation: Nightfall. Status: sole survivor. S. Matson stared at the words, absorbing the earth-shattering implications. A figure moved to the center of the control room. It was the general's aide, the young major. He was no longer looking at the screen, but was staring directly at Vance, his face a mask of utter disbelief and dawning reverence. "Echo?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion. He was older now, but the scar over his left eye was unmistakable. He had been a junior intelligence analyst attached to her last mission, a terrified lieutenant who had listened to the comms as an entire legendary unit was wiped out. "My God," he whispered loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Siu. We all thought you were dead." The control room went absolutely still. The whispers about Ghost Recon, the myth of the Whisper pilot, the legend of Operation Nightfall, it all coalesced around the quiet woman in the pilot's chair. They were not in the room with a consultant. They were in the room with a ghost. The major, who was in fact a full colonel and the general's chief of staff, straightened his shoulders. He drew himself up to his full height, and with a motion so sharp it seemed to crack the air, he rendered a perfect formal salute. It was not the casual salute for a superior officer. It was a gesture of profound, almost reverent respect, the kind reserved for fallen heroes and living legends. He was saluting Echo Point one by one. Inspired by his gesture, the other uniformed personnel in the room followed suit. Lieutenant Hayes, humbled and awestruck, rose from his chair and brought his hand to his brow. The grizzled master sergeant stood at attention, his salute as steady as the rock of the mountains outside. The young airmen, the seasoned engineers, even the civilian contractors, they all stood, their movements unified in a silent, powerful tribute. Finally, Colonel Madsen, the institutional arrogance he once wore now completely stripped away, slowly raised his own hand in salute. They were no longer acknowledging the woman who had saved their program. They were honoring the ghost who had walked out of the pages of myth and into their lives. They were recognizing the last member of Ghost Recon. Vance slowly disconnected from the neural interface. She turned in her chair, her gaze sweeping over the room full of saluting figures. Her expression remained unreadable, a calm sea over unfathomable depths. But for the first time, the deep abiding weariness in her eyes was plain to see. She offered them no words of explanation, no speech about her past, no acknowledgement of their shock. She simply gave a single slow nod of her head. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. It was an acceptance, a shared understanding that some things are honored best by silence. As the desert sunset bled purple and orange across the horizon, casting long dramatic shadows from the hangar doors, Vance stood alone with the Acheron. The drone was powered down, its sleek black shell cooled to the touch. She rested a palm against its fuselage, a silent communion between pilot and partner. The base had changed. The personnel who had once ignored or mocked her now gave her a wide, respectful berth. Their gazes were a mixture of awe and a healthy amount of fear. They spoke in hushed tones when she passed, as if afraid a normal volume would cause her to dissipate back into the ether from which she had come. Colonel Madsen approached her, his footsteps hesitant on the concrete floor. He held out the small, worn, leather-bound notebook she had left on the console. "You forgot this," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its former authority. He was no longer a commander addressing a subordinate. He was a man speaking to something far outside his comprehension. She took the notebook from him without a word, her fingers brushing his, and the brief contact seemed to carry an electric charge of history and loss. As she turned to leave, her fatigued jacket sleeve rode up her arm by a fraction of an inch, just enough for Madsen to see it clearly in the dimming light. The tattoo on her inner wrist, the ghost intertwined with the raven's feather, the symbol of her unit. He finally truly understood. She wasn't just a pilot. She was a remnant. She was the final living echo of a promise made in the shadows. She was proof that even when a mission is declared a catastrophic failure, even when a legendary unit is wiped from the official records, one of them might still be out there, moving silently, relentlessly toward the objective. The massive hangar door rumbled open to let her out and slid shut behind her, leaving Madsen alone in the cavernous space with the cooling drone. The air was still, but it hummed with the charge of her presence, a lingering testament to the woman they had so casually dismissed. A ghost had walked among them, completed her task, and faded back into the dusk.